At a chilly late November Sunday dinner in an exclusive Scottsdale estate, my son-in-law's father grabbed my 8-year-old granddaughter Hazel by the collar, lifted her, and slammed her against a glass display cabinet hard enough to shatter a ceramic plate. His wife Helena smiled. "Excellent. Now she'll remember her place." I stood up, walked to the kitchen, and made one phone call. "Drop a comment, and let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community." I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I rubbed my eyes trying to summon regret for what I was about to do to this family, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet, and Barnaby Vexley had just run up a debt he could never repay. I locked the heavy oak door of the kitchen behind me, blocking out the sound of Barnaby's booming laughter. Operating with the cold, measured precision of a retired federal white-collar investigator for the United States Treasury, I pulled out my phone. I dialed a number I had not called in 4 years. Major Crimes Lieutenant Braddock picked up on the second ring. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I dispatched a police unit and a medical team to Barnaby's estate, reporting a felony assault on a minor. I outlined the perpetrator's physical description and intoxicated state. I detailed the shattered glass and the child's visible distress. My voice never wavered. It remained entirely transactional. When you spend 32 years auditing high-level financial fraud, you learn that true power does not scream. True professionals do not waste energy on emotional shouting matches. We weaponize time, legal precision, and institutional documentation against arrogant bullies. The invisible armor of an underestimated professional is silence. I knew that walking back out there and screaming at Barnaby would only surrender my moral high ground and trigger legal liabilities. Bullies feed on your emotional reactions. They use your panic to validate their dominance. By removing my emotion from the equation, I was starving him of the very oxygen he needed to survive. I ended the call with Braddock and opened the camera app on my phone. I hit record and slipped the device into the breast pocket of my cardigan, the lens perfectly positioned. I unlocked the kitchen door and walked back into the dining room. The air smelled of expensive roasted lamb and shattered porcelain. Hazel was curled on the floor, holding her neck, her small shoulders trembling. Barnaby was leaning against the dining table, swirling a glass of scotch, continuing his arrogant banter as if he hadn't just assaulted a child. He was lecturing my son-in-law, Julian, about respect and discipline, completely unaware that his entire life was currently being recorded into federal evidence. He looked at me, a 67-year-old woman in practical shoes, and saw nothing but a harmless, invisible old grandmother. He thought he held all the cards because he owned the house and the expensive cars in the driveway. He didn't realize that I had just initiated a sequence of events that would systematically dismantle his entire empire. I simply sat back down, smoothed my napkin over my lap, and watched him talk. I let him boast. I let him incriminate himself with every arrogant word. I was filing every syllable away, building a rock-solid foundation for the retaliation that was already racing toward his front door. In my mind, I was already drafting the affidavits. I noted the precise location of the broken ceramic shards, the exact hue of the bruising beginning to form on Hazel's pale skin, and the smug, unapologetic curve of Helena's mouth as she sipped her wine. Every detail was a data point, every smirk a piece of corroborating evidence. They were so utterly confident in their superiority that they forgot the most basic rule of survival. The most dangerous person in the room is never the one shouting. It is the one quietly taking notes. I sat there listening to the clinking of silverware, observing the architecture of entitlement at work. For 32 years, I audited the deepest, most complex financial frauds for the Treasury Department. I had dismantled criminal syndicates, tracked illicit offshore accounts, and retired with 2 top commendations from the director. Yet, to my daughter Marcia, to my son-in-law Julian, and especially to the Vexley family, I was viewed merely as a harmless old woman living on a small pension. I was the quiet grandmother who drove an 8-year-old sedan and bought generic brand groceries. I had allowed them to believe this fiction because it suited me. I had been the silent investor in their version of family, quietly absorbing years of emotional slights and patronizing comments. For years, I had watched Julian get ground down by Barnaby's relentless corporate bullying. Barnaby loved to remind everyone that he owned commercial real estate across the state, that he was a titan of industry, while Julian was just a mid-level manager. I had watched Marcia shrink into herself, constantly trying to navigate the toxic undercurrents of her in-laws' demands. Barnaby and Helena operated under a dangerous cognitive distortion. They believed that generational wealth and localized monopoly created a localized immunity to the law. They lived in an exclusive gated bubble in Scottsdale, surrounded by stucco architecture, infinity pools, and luxury European imports. In their minds, their net worth exempted them from basic human decency. They thought the rules did not apply to them because they wrote the checks. But the architecture of entitlement is inherently fragile because it is built on arrogance, whereas the architecture of law is built on meticulous, unyielding paper trails. People like Barnaby mistake quiet humility for weakness. They are entirely blind to the invisible footprints they leave behind in tax filings, property deeds, and corporate registries. As I watched Barnaby pour himself another glass of expensive scotch, laughing at a joke Julian was too terrified to answer, I realized I had let this go on too long. I had treated my family's affection like a subscription, with me footing the emotional bill while they reaped the benefits. I had thought my silence was protecting Marcia and Julian, keeping the peace in a volatile ecosystem. But looking at Hazel, shivering near the cracked wood of the display cabinet, I understood my error. Silence in the face of tyranny is not peace, it is complicity. I had watched this man terrorize my family for years, assuming his financial dominance gave him absolute authority over our lives. He thought his money made him untouchable, but I knew the truth. Wealth does not make you invisible to the federal government. It simply makes your target larger. Barnaby was a man who lived loudly, who bragged about his kickbacks and his real estate monopolies at Sunday dinners. He had constructed a fortress of cash, completely unaware that he had handed the blueprints directly to a federal investigator. I didn't need to yell or threaten him. I knew that behind every arrogant boast, there was a ledger waiting to be balanced. Behind every luxury car, there was a tax return begging to be scrutinized. The Vexley family was no longer my in-laws. They were a target matrix, and I was about to initiate a full-scale audit of their existence. The wail of the sirens pierced the thick, insulated walls of the estate exactly 12 minutes after my call. The heavy oak doors burst open, and Lieutenant Braddock strode in, flanked by 2 uniformed officers and a paramedic team. Barnaby stood up, his face flushing a deep, furious crimson. He demanded to know what was happening, declaring that this was private property and threatening to have the officers' badges. Braddock completely ignored him, directing the paramedics straight to Hazel. Within moments, they had her immobilized on a stretcher. The head paramedic looked up, his expression grim, and announced she had sustained a moderate concussion and deep lacerations from the shattered glass. The kind of impact that, with a fraction more force, could have caused permanent, irreversible damage. Instead of showing an ounce of remorse at the medical diagnosis, Barnaby and Helena doubled down. Barnaby scoffed loudly, calling Julian a weakling for letting the authorities dictate family discipline. He claimed the police intervention was targeted harassment and pointed a thick finger at my son-in-law, threatening immediate legal action for defamation and emotional distress if they tried to take his granddaughter away. Helena stood beside her husband, her arms crossed, nodding in agreement. Marcia stood frozen between the stretcher, holding her daughter, and the toxic grip of her in-laws. She looked at Julian, whose eyes were wide with panic, seeing him temporarily paralyzed by a lifetime of conditioning that demanded he submit to his father's authority. Barnaby sneered, bragging about his vast real estate holdings and his deep political connections in Scottsdale. He promised that a single phone call to the mayor would make this entire incident vanish by morning. It was a spectacular display of narcissistic denial, wiping away any lingering sympathy I might have harbored. They were completely unrepentant. This was the moment the invisible armor of the underestimated professional became my greatest weapon. I watched Barnaby flail and threaten, observing the precise mechanics of his panic. An amateur would have argued with him, trying to convince a sociopath to feel empathy. I simply stood by the wall, letting him dig his grave deeper with every recorded threat. My restraint was not born of fear. It was born of absolute, cold superiority. I knew that every word he shouted about his political immunity and his untouchable wealth was just more rope to hang him with. True power does not need to justify itself to a screaming man in a dining room. I let the police do their job. I let Julian finally find his spine, stepping in front of Marcia and ordering the paramedics to take his daughter to the hospital. As the stretcher rolled past, Barnaby shouted that we would regret this, that he would bury us all in legal fees until we were homeless. I didn't react. I just looked at him with the flat, dead eyes of an auditor who has already found the missing funds. He thought this was the end of the conflict. He had no idea this was merely the preliminary hearing. I was already pulling the threads of his destruction, and he couldn't even feel the fabric of his life unraveling. He thought his intimidation tactics were working because I wasn't screaming back. He mistook my silence for submission, but as I gathered my purse and followed the paramedics out the door, I felt a deep, chilling sense of purpose. Let him scream at the police. I had much more devastating work to do in the quiet hours of the night. The next morning, I shifted my operations from immediate crisis response to professional, institutional dismantling. Family affection had officially become a business transaction, and the Vexleys were about to face a hostile takeover. I sat at my modest kitchen table, opened my laptop, and began the systematic execution of systemic justice. I didn't bother calling Barnaby to argue. I called Bernie Stoltzman. Bernie was a retired Internal Revenue Service criminal investigator, a man who had spent 30 years auditing commercial real estate empires. I gave him the name of Barnaby's holding company, Vexley Properties. I didn't ask for a favor. I requested a forensic deep dive. I wanted to know if the books were clean. There was a long pause on the line before Bernie laughed, a dry, knowing sound. He told me to give him 4 days. Next, I enlisted Oira Rukold, a ruthless family law attorney who ate arrogant men for breakfast. I handed her the medical reports, the police records, and the video I had covertly recorded in the dining room. I instructed her to draft the most aggressive emergency restraining orders and protective filings permitted by state law. I was shifting the battlefield from the emotional swamp of family drama to the cold, sterile environment of a federal court. 5 days later, Bernie called me back. The architecture of entitlement had left a massive, glaring paper trail. Barnaby's real estate empire was a house of cards built on $3,200,000 in hidden tax evasion. He had been running a sophisticated curbing operation, structuring fraudulent real estate kickbacks through a web of shell companies to avoid detection. But the most lethal piece of intelligence was hidden in the corporate registry. The primary shell company Barnaby used to hide his illicit assets was legally registered in Arizona under Helena's name. She was not just an accessory, she was a co-principal. This is why you never interrupt an arrogant man while he is bragging. While Barnaby was busy believing that his generational wealth granted him immunity from consequences, he had carelessly documented every single felony. Bullies who operate in local monopolies always assume they are the smartest people in the room. They assume no one is checking the math because everyone is too afraid to ask for the ledger. They construct an architecture of entitlement, believing their money shields them from scrutiny, completely forgetting that the architecture of law is designed to crush them. I stared at the financial reports glowing on my computer screen, feeling no joy, no sadness, just the clinical satisfaction of a balanced equation. Barnaby thought his power came from his ability to intimidate an 8-year-old child and belittle his son-in-law. He had no concept of the invisible, grinding machinery of federal compliance. He didn't realize that his entire identity was tied to numbers on a spreadsheet, and I had just erased the bottom line. I forwarded the entire dossier to my old contacts at the Department of Justice and the Arizona Department of Revenue. I didn't include a passionate plea for justice. I merely attached the files with a single sentence, confirming structured fraud and tax evasion at Vexley Properties. The trap was set. I closed my laptop and poured a cup of black coffee. The silence in my kitchen was absolute, a stark contrast to the chaos I had just unleashed upon the Vexley estate. They were currently waking up in their mansion, oblivious to the fact that their financial lifeblood had just been severed. The reckoning was a mathematical certainty. The collapse of a paper empire does not happen with a loud explosion. It happens in devastating, suffocating silence. The investigation yielded results with terrifying speed. Because I had handed the federal authorities a perfectly curated package of forensic evidence, there was no need for a lengthy discovery phase. The kill shot was delivered through a series of synchronized legal and financial strikes. First, the Arizona Department of Revenue issued an immediate suspension of all Barnaby's commercial operating licenses. 2 days later, his commercial lenders, alerted by the sudden regulatory action, triggered the default clauses in his contracts. They froze his floor plans, locked his asset lines, and voided his loan covenants overnight. Without access to capital, Vexley Properties ceased to exist as a functioning entity. It was simply a mountain of toxic debt. But the true criminal twist arrived on a Thursday morning. The Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division officially opened a federal felony tax fraud probe. Barnaby was no longer just a wealthy bully facing a civil lawsuit. He was the primary target of a federal indictment. The illusion of his immunity shattered the moment the federal agents delivered the notices to his Scottsdale estate. The devastation was absolute, but the most satisfying collateral damage belonged to Helena. She had stood by her husband, smiling while he abused a child, secure in her belief that she was untouchable. But when the federal notices arrived, Helena discovered the fatal flaw in Barnaby's grand design. Her own name was front and center on the shell company registry. Barnaby hadn't just hidden money, he had exposed his wife to direct criminal liability. She wasn't an innocent bystander. In the eyes of the federal government, she was an active co-conspirator facing the exact same felony charges as her husband. This is the ultimate vulnerability of the entitled class. They build their fortresses out of arrogance, convinced that their wealth makes them invincible. They believe their own localized myths of supremacy, ignoring the fact that the architecture of law does not care about their country club memberships or their imported cars. Barnaby had pushed Hazel into a glass cabinet, thinking there would be no consequences because he was the king of his tiny, self-made kingdom. He never fathomed that someone would step outside his kingdom and summon an empire to crush him. The paper trail he had so carelessly left behind had become a concrete wall closing in on them both. I received a frantic voicemail from Marcia that afternoon. Her voice was trembling, entirely stripped of the toxic influence her parents had exerted over her. She told me Barnaby's accounts were frozen, that Helena was screaming at her lawyers, that the entire estate was in a state of absolute panic. I listened to the voicemail once, deleted it, and went back to reviewing Oira's final protective filings. There was no path to redemption left for the Vexley family. They weren't just cruel, entitled abusers anymore. They were indicted federal criminals, and their financial oxygen had just been permanently cut off. I poured myself a glass of iced water and stared out at the quiet street in front of my home. The contrast between my calm afternoon and the complete destruction of Barnaby's world was the truest form of accounting. I didn't need to gloat. The numbers had done all the talking. The balance sheet of their lives had been weighed, measured, and found catastrophically wanting. The final execution of judgment arrived at 6 in the morning. Federal agents, backed by local law enforcement, breached the gates of the Scottsdale estate to execute the search warrants. Barnaby Vexley was arrested in his own foyer, handcuffed while still wearing his silk bathrobe. The King of Scottsdale was reduced to a screaming, red-faced suspect, shouting about his political influence and demanding to speak to the mayor. The agents ignored him, methodically carrying boxes of financial records out to their waiting vehicles. It was the ultimate power reversal. The man who had effortlessly lifted an 8-year-old child off the ground in a fit of arrogant fury was now entirely powerless, led away in quiet disgrace. Helena, stripped of her smug superiority, showed up at the hospital later that afternoon, her eyes red and swollen. She cornered Marcia and Julian in the waiting room near Hazel's pediatric suite, begging them for help. She pleaded for Julian to post bail, to use whatever resources they had to secure legal defense. She sobbed that they were losing everything, that the federal government was seizing the house, the cars, the bank accounts. Julian, who had spent years shrinking under their relentless corporate bullying, finally stood tall. Backed by Oira's emergency restraining orders, which granted him and Marcia full legal distance and protection from his parents, he looked at his mother with absolute coldness. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply handed her a copy of the restraining order Oira had expedited that morning. He told her to leave his family alone. I arrived at the hospital just as Helena was being escorted out by security. She saw me standing by the elevator doors, calm, dressed in a simple beige cardigan. She lunged forward, her voice cracking as she accused me of destroying her family. I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I engaged the invisible armor of the professional investigator one last time. I looked her directly in the eyes and let the silence stretch until her frantic energy collapsed into despair. I didn't destroy your family, Helena, I said, my tone as flat and transactional as a bank ledger. You did that the moment you smiled, while your husband smashed my granddaughter into a glass cabinet. I just provided the federal government with the receipts. I turned and walked into the elevator, leaving her sobbing in the lobby. Barnaby was convicted in state court for felony child assault and subsequently found guilty in federal court of wire fraud and tax evasion. The combined sentences ensured he would spend well over a decade behind bars. Helena accepted a plea deal for criminal conspiracy, trading her luxury estate for 5 years of strict federal probation and total financial ruin. They were stripped of their wealth, their status, and their illusion of untouchability. The balance had been restored. The debt was paid in full. There was no joy in my retaliation, only the clinical satisfaction of a completed audit. I had closed the file on Barnaby Vexley, permanently archiving him in a concrete cell where his money could no longer hurt anyone. I walked down the sterile hospital corridor toward Hazel's room, my footsteps soundless on the linoleum. The toxic empire that had suffocated my family was entirely dismantled, brick by fraudulent brick. They had believed they were the untouchable predators in our story, but they had simply been the prey of their own massive hubris. I pushed open the heavy door to Hazel's room, leaving the chaos behind me forever. Months later, the chill of late November had given way to a warm, gentle spring. Hazel sleeps peacefully through the night now, her head fully healed, the concussive headaches a distant memory. She spends her weekends on my back porch, learning how to whittle wood and talking endlessly about the hockey team she just joined. Julian and Marcia have rebuilt their lives, moving into a modest but peaceful home just a few miles away. With the permanent restraining orders secured, the shadows of the Vexley estate no longer dictate their existence. Julian walks taller now, no longer the quiet, beaten-down man at the dinner table. Marcia has found her own voice, free from the suffocating demands of her toxic parents. We sit together on the porch while the dog sleeps at our feet, listening to the rhythmic sounds of Hazel whittling a piece of pine. I watch them, feeling the deep, settled weight of justice achieved. I've come to realize that true power is not found in screaming, boasting, or breaking the vulnerable to prove your strength. True justice is quiet, meticulous, and incredibly patient. It does not require a dramatic emotional outburst. It only requires that you pay attention while the arrogant expose their own weaknesses. Bullies like Barnaby construct their lives on a foundation of entitlement and noise, assuming their wealth makes them immune to the rules of human decency. But quiet resilience will always outlast loud arrogance. You don't need to fight a bully on their terms. You just need to step aside, hold the door open, and make absolutely certain the right authorities are watching when they walk into their own prison. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes, it's just the clinical act of closing a ledger so you can finally be free. I look at my hands, the same hands that spent decades sorting through fraudulent tax returns, and I know they did the right thing. The architecture of the law worked exactly as it was designed to. It crushed the entitlement and restored the balance. We are safe now, shielded by the invisible armor of accountability and the quiet strength of family. The nightmare in Scottsdale is over, replaced by the steady, comforting sound of wood shavings hitting the porch floor. If this story resonated with you, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel for more stories of quiet justice, and tell me in the comments down below, who is the underestimated protector in your own family?